I never thought I'd see the day when the walls that held my entire life would crumble into ash. At 72, you think you've seen every kind of loss a person can endure. Parents gone, friends buried, even my husband before his time. But nothing prepares you for standing in the middle of the night, watching your home, the place where every birthday candle was blown out, every photograph once hung, swallowed in orange flames. It was late, too late for a woman my age to still be awake. But I'd been restless. I remember hearing a strange popping sound, like someone throwing sand against the windows. By the time I pulled myself out of bed, the smoke had already started seeping under the doorframe. You don't think at a moment like that. Instinct takes over. My legs might be slow, my joints stiff, but survival can make a body move in ways you'd never imagine. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a battered old suitcase that had been shoved under my bed for decades. It still smelled faintly of mothballs, the kind of smell you'd think would be a nuisance, but in that moment it felt like an anchor to the past. My fingers fumbled for a few belongings, an old shawl, my glasses, a photo or two. There wasn't time for anything else. By the time I reached the porch, the fire had already eaten through half the roof. The night sky glowed, bright and cruel, as if the stars themselves had turned to embers. Neighbors gathered at a distance, their faces lit by the flames. Someone had called the fire department, but I knew it was too late. The house was old, dry as tinder, a lifetime collected in its bones, my wedding dress folded neatly in a trunk, the baby shoes I'd kept from when my son first learned to walk, the stack of letters from my husband back when he was overseas. All of it would soon be nothing but ash floating in the air. I didn't cry. Not then. I couldn't. Maybe it was shock, or maybe there's a part of you that turns to stone when you see your past going up in smoke. I stood there in my nightgown, clutching that suitcase, and felt the heat against my face. People came up to me, offering blankets, water, soft words. I nodded, but I couldn't hear them. My ears were full of the roaring fire, my heart pounding louder than any comfort they could offer. When the firemen arrived, they did what they could, but I could tell by their body language they were fighting a losing battle. The house groaned like an old tree giving way to wind. I had lived in that house for nearly 50 years, and in less than 1 hour it was gone. I was 72, and I was homeless. The strangeness of that realization hit me only when I sat in the back of an ambulance while they checked my lungs for smoke damage. I looked down at the suitcase resting on my lap, the zipper bent from years of neglect. Inside, I had only scraps, no real possessions, just fragments. That's when the first tear slipped down my cheek, not for the furniture, not for the walls or the roof. For the pieces of my life I would never hold again. For the smell of my husband's aftershave that still lingered on his old coats. For the tiny cracks in the hallway floor I used to curse, but which had carried the sound of my son's footsteps when he was small. By the time the fire was out, dawn had begun to break. The sun rose without apology, shining its light over a blackened skeleton where my home had once stood. The crowd had dispersed. The fire trucks were gone. And I was left standing on a patch of grass with nothing but smoke in my hair and a suitcase in my hand. That morning, my son arrived. He drove up, looking half awake, his shirt untucked. He wrapped me in his arms, told me I could come stay with him for a little while. I leaned against him, exhausted, and let him guide me into his car. But even then, even before I knew what words would later cut me to the bone, I felt it. A distance. A sense that this wasn't the beginning of comfort. This was the beginning of something else entirely. I turned once more to look at the smoldering ruins as we drove away. I whispered goodbye under my breath, not just to the house, but to the woman I had been while living there, because she was gone too. My son's house was quiet when we pulled into the driveway. Too quiet. His wife was a woman who liked order, silence, and space. The kind of space that made someone like me feel like an intruder before I even crossed the threshold. Still, I told myself it was temporary, just until I figured out what to do next. He carried my suitcase inside as if it weighed nothing, though to me it felt heavy with everything I'd lost. I sat down gingerly on their spotless sofa, the kind of couch you look at more than you sit on. My daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway, hair tied back, her expression caught somewhere between polite sympathy and irritation. "Oh, hello," she said, as though she hadn't expected me to survive the night. She offered tea, but her eyes flicked to the clock, like every minute spent in my presence was borrowed time. I stayed quiet. I didn't want to cause trouble. I told myself it would only be for a week or two, until the insurance people sorted things out, until I could find my footing. My son brought me a blanket and pillow and set them neatly at the end of the sofa. "You'll be comfortable here, Mom," he said, with a tone that carried more hope than conviction. The first night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I listened to the muffled sounds of their whispered conversation upstairs, the creak of floorboards under their pacing. My heart knew even then what my head didn't want to admit. I wasn't truly welcome. By the third day, it was no longer a feeling, but a fact. I had just finished folding the blanket when my son came down the stairs, his face pale with nerves. He sat across from me, rubbing his hands together, searching for words he didn't want to say. "Mom," he began, I need to be honest." I braced myself, though I didn't know for what. He cleared his throat, then spoke softly, as if that would soften the blow. "Mom, my wife doesn't want you here." The words fell between us like a hammer striking glass. My chest tightened. For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. Surely, after all I'd done for him, after raising him through fevers and scraped knees, after staying up all night when he was a teenager and hadn't come home on time, surely he wouldn't say this, but he did. "I tried to explain," he continued, not meeting my eyes. She feels it's too much. Too much stress, too much disruption," I wanted to shout. To remind him of the nights I'd gone hungry so he could eat, the years of sacrifice, the love that had no end. But the words caught in my throat. I realized in that instant that pleading wouldn't change anything. I had always carried myself with dignity, and I would not beg for shelter now. So instead, I nodded, slowly, calmly, as though he had just asked me if I'd like more tea. "Of course," I whispered. "I understand." He looked relieved, and that cut deeper than the rejection itself. Relief that I wouldn't fight him. Relief that his conscience would be spared. I walked upstairs and retrieved my suitcase. The same suitcase that had followed me from the fire now followed me out of his house. My son held the door open, his mouth opening and closing, searching for something kind to say, but nothing came. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from some neighbor's fireplace. I clutched my coat tighter around me, though the cold wasn't what made me shiver. At the bus stop, I sat alone, the suitcase balanced on my knees. My mind raced, not with anger, but with a heavy, hollow ache. Where does a 72-year-old woman go when even her own blood turns her away? I reached into the front pocket of my suitcase, looking for a tissue. Instead, my fingers brushed against something hard. I pulled it out. My old address book, leather cracked, its pages yellow with age. I flipped through names I hadn't seen in years, neighbors long gone, friends who had passed on. And then, one name stopped me cold. My breath caught in my throat. A name written in my own youthful handwriting from a time before my marriage, before children, before life became practical. The first man I had ever loved. His number was faded, smudged, but still legible. My hands trembled as I traced it with my finger. I hadn't thought of him in years, yet here he was waiting for me in a forgotten book at the bottom of a suitcase. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at that number. The buses came and went. People hurried past, but I was somewhere else, back in the glow of memory, back in the days when love was new and reckless. and for the first time since the fire, since the rejection, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost forever: hope. The bus ride felt endless, though it was only 20 minutes to the cheapest motel I could find. I sat with my suitcase clutched on my lap like a child clings to a teddy bear, afraid that if I let go, I'd vanish with it. The motel clerk barely looked up from her crossword when I asked for a room. She handed me a key with a chipped plastic tag, and I climbed the narrow stairs to a room that smelled faintly of bleach and loneliness. A bed, a nightstand, a lamp with a crooked shade. No photographs on the walls, no warmth in the air. It was just 4 walls and a door that locked, and that would have to be enough. I set the suitcase on the bed and sat down beside it. My hands lingered on the brass latch before finally clicking it open. Inside, my life looked pitifully small. A shawl folded neatly, though its edges had been singed by sparks. My reading glasses still dusted with soot. A framed picture of my son at 6 years old, gap-toothed and smiling. A pair of slippers I'd shoved in without thinking. That was all. Everything else had been claimed by the fire. As I sorted through the few things, my fingers brushed against the cracked leather spine of the address book. I pulled it out slowly, almost reverently, as if it were a sacred relic. That little book had followed me through decades, though I hadn't opened it in years. I remember buying it in a corner shop when I was barely 20, my handwriting neat and looping, as though trying to prove something to the world. I had written names carefully, as if each one carried weight. Over the years, the pages yellowed, the ink smudged, but the names were still there, a record of every person who had touched my life. I flipped through it page by page, like leafing through time itself. Some names made me smile. Mrs. Deacon, the neighbor who had always brought over her rhubarb pie when I was newly married. My old friend Ruth, who had written letters from across the country until arthritis claimed her hands. Some names hurt. My husband's work number, still there, though he had been gone for years. My parents' address, long since demolished. People who once filled my life with noise and laughter, reduced now to faded ink. And then I saw it. His name. Written in my own youthful hand, bolder and surer than I remembered myself ever being. Thomas Caldwell. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. My breath caught, and I ran my thumb over the number, though it was nearly rubbed away from time. Thomas. The man I had loved before anyone else. Before marriage. Before children. Before life had hardened around me like old clay. The memories rushed back all at once. His laugh, deep and unrestrained. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The summer nights we spent walking by the river, our futures stretched out before us like endless sky. We were young, reckless, convinced that love could carry us anywhere. But love alone doesn't always win. He had dreams of traveling, of seeing the world, while I had been raised to believe that security mattered more. So when a different man, steady, practical, promising a life of stability, asked for my hand, I said yes. Thomas left town soon after. I never saw him again. Until now. Until this moment, staring at his name on a page I'd nearly forgotten existed. I sat on the edge of the bed, the motel lamp flickering, my heart pounding like it hadn't in years. What if he was gone? What if the number no longer worked? What if he answered, and he'd long since stopped caring? But what if he hadn't? I closed the book, pressing it to my chest, torn between fear and longing. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the radiator, the ticking of the cheap clock on the wall. I had no home, no place to return to. My son had turned me away, and here, in my hands, was the only thread connecting me to something that felt like possibility. I told myself I'd wait until morning to decide, but sleep never came. I lay awake, the book on the nightstand, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, not as it must be now, older, lined, worn, but as it had been, as it had looked the day he kissed my forehead and said goodbye. By the time dawn crept in through the thin motel curtains, I knew. Fear or no fear, there was only one thing left to do. I had to dial that number. Morning light always has a way of making everything look smaller, tamer. The motel room didn't feel quite so haunted in daylight, but the knot in my chest remained, tight as ever. I sat at the small table with the address book open, the telephone beside me, my hand hovering like a bird unsure if it dared to land. The number looked fragile, written in ink that had nearly faded into the paper. It had probably been decades since anyone had dialed it. My mind spun with excuses. Maybe it had been disconnected years ago. Maybe someone else lived there now, someone who would hang up on a confused old woman. I must have picked up the phone and put it back down a dozen times. My fingers trembled so badly I almost couldn't press the buttons. But in the silence of that room, with no one left in my corner, what did I have to lose? So I dialed. Each ring stretched like an eternity. I counted them in my head. 1, 2, 3. My pulse pounded in my ears. On the fourth ring, I nearly hung up. And then, hello? The voice was older, rasped with years, but deep, familiar. I froze, the receiver slick in my hand. My throat closed. For a moment, I was 20 again, standing under the summer sky, listening to that same voice laugh at something only the two of us found funny. "Thomas," I whispered. There was a pause, a long one. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, or maybe the name meant nothing anymore. Then came a sharp intake of breath. Rosemary. My name fell from his lips like a prayer, soft and stunned. He hadn't forgotten. My eyes filled, and I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, desperate to hold on to that sound. "Yes," I managed, my voice breaking. "It's me." Silence again, but this time it was thick with emotion. I could almost hear his heart racing on the other end. Finally, he exhaled, shaky. My God, after all these years. We stumbled through the first few sentences, awkward like strangers, yet charged with something deeper, older. I told him about the fire, my son, the suitcase. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the words cracked under the weight of humiliation. "You're alone?" he asked, his tone sharper now, protective in a way that startled me. "Yes," I admitted. I didn't know who else to call. There was no hesitation in his reply. "Tell me where you are." I gave him the name of the motel, my hands still shaking. I expected him to say he'd call later, or perhaps offer a polite apology, some empty promise to visit someday, but instead he said only this: "Stay there." "I'm coming." And then the line went dead. I sat frozen, staring at the receiver as though it might explain what had just happened. He was coming? After all these years? After everything? I looked at the address book still open on the table, the faded ink now glowing in the morning sun. I pressed my palm flat against the page, as if to steady myself. The hours that followed were a blur. I paced the small room, straightened the bed, smoothed my shawl, only to undo it all with restless hands. I caught myself in the cracked mirror, cheeks flushed like a schoolgirl waiting for her date to arrive. It was ridiculous. I was 72. My skin sagged, my hair thin, my back curved. But hope doesn't measure wrinkles. It only beats louder when it's been buried too long. At one point, I almost convinced myself he wouldn't come, that the shock of the call had stirred him, but once he hung up, he'd think better of it. People change. Time erases passion. What if he regretted even answering? But then, as the afternoon light slanted across the thin curtains, I heard it. A knock at the door. My heart leapt. My hands trembled as I crossed the room, each step heavier than the last. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the door, afraid to open it, afraid of what time might have done to him, to us. Finally, I turned the handle, and there he was. Older, yes. Hair silver, shoulders stooped, His face carried lines etched by years I hadn't been there to witness. But his eyes, oh, those eyes, still the same, still deep and knowing, still the color of a storm waiting to break. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze soft but steady. Then his mouth curved into the smallest of smiles, and with a voice that trembled just enough to betray his heart, he said 3 words, "You kept me waiting." For a moment, I couldn't move. His words hung in the air between us, simple, playful, yet heavy with everything left unsaid over decades. You kept me waiting. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to collapse into his arms, but instead I stood there gripping the doorknob like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I whispered his name, Thomas, like it was both a greeting and a question. He gave me that smile again, the same lopsided grin I remembered from summers past. It hadn't changed, even if everything else had. And then, without asking, without ceremony, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. I don't know what surprised me more, that he was still strong enough to hold me tight, or that I melted so easily into the embrace. My face pressed against his shoulder, and for the first time since the fire, since the rejection, I felt safe. Not saved, but held. We stayed like that longer than 2 people usually do at a doorway. When we finally pulled back, he looked at me as though cataloging every line, every wrinkle, every change. "You're here," he said softly, as if still trying to convince himself I wasn't just another ghost from his past. "I am," I replied, though it sounded almost like an apology. He motioned inside, and I stepped back to let him in. His presence seemed to fill the shabby motel room, suddenly making it less bleak, less cold. He set down the small duffel bag he carried, glanced around, and frowned. "This place doesn't suit you," he muttered. I gave a short laugh. "It suits what's left of me." His eyes flicked to the suitcase on the bed, still packed. He walked over and touched the worn leather as though it were a fragile artifact. "This all you've got?" I nodded. My throat tightened, but I refused to cry. He didn't pity me. Not in the way others had when they'd seen me at the fire. Instead, his expression was steady, almost determined. "Then it's enough," he said simply. We sat at the small table, the one with peeling laminate edges. For a while, we just stared at each other, drinking each other in like parched travelers finding water. Time had reshaped us, but beneath the lines and years, we were still ourselves. Finally, he leaned back and asked, "Do you remember the last time we spoke?" How could I forget? I saw it as clearly as if it were yesterday, standing at the train station, his suitcase by his side, his face set with both hope and heartbreak. He had wanted me to come with him then, to chase the world together, and I had said no. "Yes," I whispered. "You asked me to go, and I stayed." "And I left," he finished, his voice low. We let the silence sit between us, a silence built from years of roads not taken. I reached across the table, my hand shaking, and laid it on top of his. His skin was rougher now, his knuckles thick, but the warmth was the same. He turned his hand palm up and closed his fingers gently around mine. "Why are you here?" I asked finally. "Why now?" He gave a half smile, half sigh. "Because you called." It was such a simple answer, yet it undid me. After a lifetime of feeling forgotten, cast aside, unwanted, even by my own family, here was someone who didn't need a reason bigger than my voice. We talked until the sun dipped low, about where life had taken us, about what we'd gained and what we'd lost. He told me he had never married, said he'd come close once, but his heart hadn't been in it. "Some loves," he murmured, "don't get replaced." I told him about my marriage, about the years of raising a family, about the silence that crept in after my husband grew more interested in work than in me. I told him about losing my husband, about the loneliness that had stretched wider each year since. We didn't judge each other's choices. We just listened. The years fell away with every story, every laugh, every tear. At one point, I noticed how the motel lamp cast a golden glow on his face, softening the lines, and for a heartbeat, I saw the boy he had once been. It made my chest ache in a way both sweet and sorrowful. When the night grew late, he finally stood. "Come," he said. "You're not staying here another night." I started to protest, pride prickling. After all, I'd only just gotten used to this room. But he silenced me with a look, steady and unyielding. "You've carried enough alone," he said. "Let me carry the rest with you." And for the first time in years, I didn't argue. I simply nodded, closed my suitcase, and followed him out into the night. The night air was cool as we stepped outside, my suitcase trailing behind like a stubborn shadow. He led me to his car, a sturdy sedan, not new, not flashy, but well kept, the kind of car that said more about reliability than pride. He opened the passenger door for me, and for a fleeting moment, I felt like a girl again, standing shyly while he held open the door all those years ago. The drive was mostly silent. The road stretched dark and empty, the headlights carving tunnels through the night. I kept stealing glances at him, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, the profile of his face softened by the glow of the dashboard. He had aged, of course. His jaw was heavier, his hair a crown of silver, his shoulders slightly rounded. But I could still see the boy who once kissed me under the summer stars, whispering promises we were too young to keep. I closed my eyes, and the memories swept in like a tide I could no longer hold back. I was 17 when I met Thomas. It was at a church picnic, of all places. I had been serving lemonade, my hair tied back with a ribbon, trying to look useful but not too eager. He was older, 21, standing with a group of boys near the edge of the field. He caught my eye once, then again, and before long he left the group and walked straight toward me. "Got any left for me?" he'd asked, pointing at the pitcher, though I could tell he didn't care about lemonade. I laughed, nerves fluttering, and poured him a glass with shaky hands. When our fingers brushed as he took it, something sparked. It was quick, barely a moment, but it changed everything. That summer became ours. We walked by the river at dusk, his arm draped loosely around my shoulders, my head leaning against him as if it belonged there. He talked about wanting to see the world, to build something bigger than the small town we lived in. I listened, half in awe, half in fear, because I had been raised to think of home as the center of everything. One night, lying in the grass, staring up at the stars, he turned to me. "Marry me someday," he'd said suddenly with the unshakable certainty of youth. I had laughed then, not because I didn't want to, but because it felt too big, too impossible. Still, I remember whispering, "Maybe I will." But then the autumn came, and with it, reality. My parents disapproved of him, calling him a dreamer without roots. When another man came along, a man who worked at the bank, steady, dependable, they pushed me toward him, and when he asked for my hand, I said yes. I told myself it was the smart choice. Stability over passion, security over uncertainty. Thomas left soon after. He stood at the train station, his suitcase in hand, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. And maybe, deep down, I knew he was right. The car hit a bump, jolting me back to the present. I opened my eyes and found him glancing at me, as if he sensed I had drifted somewhere far away. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Everything," I admitted. "Those days, how young we were." He gave a low chuckle, roughened with age. "I still remember the ribbon you wore in your hair. Red, wasn't it?" I blinked, stunned. After all these years, he remembered a ribbon. Tears pricked my eyes. "It was red," I said softly. "I can't believe you remembered." "I never forgot," he said simply, his eyes never leaving the road. We drove in silence again, but it wasn't empty anymore. The air between us was thick with unspoken truths, with the ghosts of the people we had once been. When we finally pulled into his driveway, I stared at the house before me. It was modest, tucked back beneath tall oaks, its windows glowing warmly. Not grand, not new, but alive. A home. He turned off the engine and looked at me. "Welcome back," he said, not just to his house, but to him, to us. And in that moment, sitting in his car with the weight of the years pressing in, I realized something I hadn't dared to believe. Some loves don't die. They just wait. The warmth of his home wrapped around me the moment we stepped inside. It smelled faintly of cedar and brewed coffee, familiar in a way that made me ache. The living room was simple. Books stacked neatly on shelves, an old armchair with a blanket draped over it, photographs in modest frames. No wife's touch, no family portraits. Just him. He set my suitcase by the door, then gestured toward the sofa. "Sit," he said, not as a command, but with a kind of quiet insistence, like he'd been waiting years for me to be in that very spot. I lowered myself onto the cushions, my body weary but my mind restless. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 steaming mugs. "Chamomile," he said, placing one in front of me. "You used to love it." I stared at him, astonished. That was 50 years ago. He shrugged, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "I remember what matters." The tea was warm in my hands, though it couldn't calm the tremor in my chest. We sat in silence for a while, the clock ticking softly on the wall, until I finally spoke. "You never married," I said, though it wasn't really a question. I had noticed the absence of rings, of photographs, of evidence of another life. He shook his head, came close once. Her name was Margaret. Kind woman. But she knew. She said she could tell there was someone else living in my heart. Even if she'd never met you, she deserved more than half a man. His honesty pierced me, sharp and clean. I set the mug down, afraid my hands would spill it. "All this time, you never moved on?" "I moved forward," he said. "Worked, traveled, made a life." "But moving on?" He met my eyes then, steady and unflinching. "No." I wanted to say I had been faithful to the memory of him too, but that would have been a lie. I had married. I had built a family. I had played the role of wife, mother, caretaker. And yet, sitting across from him now, I realized that in the quiet corners of my heart, he had always lingered. I took a shaky breath. My marriage wasn't what people thought. He was good to me in his way. Provided, kept the roof over our heads, but he was always gone, at work, with friends, anywhere but with me. And when he was home, it was as if he wasn't. I was lonely, Thomas, lonely in a house full of people. His face softened, lines deepening with empathy. "I wondered," he said quietly. "I used to check the papers sometimes, see if there was mention of you. When I read the obituary, I thought maybe I'd missed my chance forever." "You looked for me?" My voice cracked. He nodded. "Once. Years ago. Came through town, but by then you had a son, a husband, a life. I didn't want to intrude, so I turned around, I covered my mouth with my hand, the weight of what could have been crashing over me. I wish you had stayed," I whispered. His eyes flickered, pain etched deep. "So do I, but maybe we had to live the lives we did to end up here now. Maybe this is the only way we could have found our way back." The words settled in me like embers, painful but glowing. I wanted to argue, to cry out for the decades lost, but he was right. We couldn't rewrite the past. We could only hold what remained. He reached across the space between us, his hand hovering just above mine until I slid my fingers into his. His grip was firm, grounding. "We're not young anymore," he said, "but maybe that's a gift. We don't have to waste time pretending. We know what we are, and what we were." For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a mother, not as a widow, not as a burden, but as myself. The clock chimed softly, reminding us of the late hour. I should have been exhausted, but my veins buzzed with energy. I hadn't felt this alive in decades. He squeezed my hand once before letting go. "You should rest," he said. "We'll talk more tomorrow." There's so much to say, I nodded, though sleep felt impossible. Tomorrow. For the first time in so long, tomorrow sounded like a promise instead of a burden. As I lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, the words circled in my mind, warming me like the chamomile had not. You kept me waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally time to stop waiting. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway. For a moment, half asleep, I thought I was back in my old house. That familiar ritual, the warmth of a morning cup, felt like something only memory could hold. But when I opened my eyes, I saw the unfamiliar ceiling, the neatly folded quilt at the edge of the bed, and I remembered. My home was gone. I slipped into the kitchen, my shawl wrapped tightly around my shoulders. Thomas was already at the table, the newspaper spread out in front of him, 2 mugs waiting. He looked up as though he had been expecting me all along. "Good morning," he said. "Coffee's just how you like it. 2 sugars, no cream." I blinked at him. "How do you remember these things?" He gave a small smile. "I told you last night. Some things don't leave you." The kindness in his voice warmed me, but it also unsettled me. I wasn't used to being cared for anymore. Not in that way. My son loved me. I knew he did. But his love was filtered through obligation, through distance. This was different. Gentle, attentive, familiar. We sipped our coffee in companionable silence until finally I set my mug down and spoke the thought that had been gnawing at me. "Thomas, I can't stay here, not for long." He folded the paper neatly and set it aside, his eyes steady on mine. "And why not?" "Because I don't want to be a burden." The word came out sharper than I intended. "You've lived your life alone on your terms. I can't come barging in at 72, dragging my suitcase and my problems with me." His brows furrowed. "Is that how you see yourself? As a problem?" I bristled, defensive. "I lost everything in that fire. I have no home, no plan, no place to go. What else am I but a burden?" The silence that followed was heavy, but not cold. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You are not a burden, Rosemary. You are the woman I once loved, and the woman I never forgot. Do you think I'd let you stay in some dingy motel room if I thought you'd weigh me down? Number. You're here because this is where you belong." My throat tightened. I wanted to believe him, but years of being useful had carved deep grooves in me. I had been the caretaker, the provider, the mother, the wife. Now, with nothing left to give, I didn't know how to exist. I shook my head. I don't know how to accept this. I've spent my whole life standing on my own 2 feet. He chuckled softly. "You mean holding everyone else up?" He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "Maybe it's time someone held you up for once." The words struck deep, stirring something I had buried. I realized I had never allowed myself to lean on anyone, not even my husband, who had been present in name more than in spirit. And now, with Thomas sitting across from me, offering his strength so freely I didn't know how to say yes. We spent the rest of the day in a quiet rhythm. He showed me his garden, proud of the tomatoes and peppers he grew with careful hands. I cooked lunch with what little was in his pantry, laughing when he teased me about still seasoning food, like an old lady. There were moments when I forgot the heaviness, when it felt almost natural to be there with him. But at night, as I lay in the guest bed, the doubts returned. I thought of my son, of his wife's cold eyes, of the words that had pushed me out. "Mom, my wife doesn't want you here." Did they think I'd run to Thomas out of desperation? Maybe I had. And what then? What kind of future could 2 people in their 70s hope for when the years left ahead were fewer than the years behind. I stared at the ceiling and whispered into the darkness, "I don't know if I can do this." From the room across the hall, faintly, I heard Thomas cough, shuffle, then settle again. The sound was ordinary, unremarkable, but it grounded me, reminding me I wasn't alone. For now, at least, I wasn't alone, and maybe that was enough. It's strange how quickly the unfamiliar can start to feel like routine. Within a week, I found myself waking to the sound of the kettle whistling in Thomas's kitchen, the creak of his old floorboards, the shuffle of his slippers as he moved about in the mornings. At first, I kept expecting to feel like an intruder, like I was tiptoeing through someone else's life. But slowly, his home began to open itself to me, like it had been waiting. The first time I cooked dinner, he hovered at the counter, watching with an amused smile. "You always did insist on peeling potatoes the wrong way," he teased, pointing at the knife in my hand. I rolled my eyes. "There is no wrong way if it gets the job done." "You say that now, but 50 years ago you swore there was only one proper way." I laughed, shaking my head. "You remember the most ridiculous things." "I remember you," he said simply, and for a moment I had to look away before he saw the heat rising in my cheeks. We ate together at the small table, knees bumping like we were clumsy kids again. He told stories about the places he'd seen. The coastlines of Ireland, the crowded markets of Morocco, the vast quiet of Montana's plains. I listened, sometimes envious, sometimes grateful he had lived enough for both of us. In return, I shared stories of raising my son, of school plays and scraped knees, of holidays where the turkey always burned a little at the edges. As I spoke, I realized I wasn't just telling him my past. I was weaving him into it, as if he'd been there all along. There were tender moments, too, quiet and ordinary, folding laundry side by side, sitting in the garden, watching sparrows dart among the tomato vines. Even bickering had its place. One afternoon, he scolded me for trying to carry a heavy box from the attic. "You'll hurt yourself," he said, taking it from my hands. "I'm not helpless," I snapped back, more sharply than I intended. "I never said you were," he replied evenly, setting the box down. "But I'm here. You don't have to do it all alone anymore." His words disarmed me, left me staring at him with a lump in my throat. I wasn't used to being cared for, not like this, not without strings or conditions. At night, I lay in the guest room, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The loneliness that had weighed on me for so long seemed lighter, as though his presence alone could steady the air. Still, I wrestled with unease. This wasn't my house. This wasn't my life. What if he woke up one day and realized I didn't fit here? One evening, after dinner, I finally voiced the fear. We were sitting in the living room, the lamplight soft around us, the air rich with the scent of chamomile tea. "Thomas," I began, my hands curled tightly around my mug, "do you ever wonder if this is just temporary? If I'm just a guest passing through your life again?" He set down his cup, leaned forward, and met my eyes. "Rosemary, I don't think of you as a guest. Not now, not ever. You walked back into my life when I thought the door had closed forever. I'm not letting that go." The conviction in his voice made my chest ache. I wanted to argue, to remind him of how fragile this was, but instead I let myself believe him, just for that moment. The days slipped into weeks. We laughed more. I found myself humming in the kitchen, something I hadn't done in years. He caught me once, grinned, and started humming along, off-key but happy. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when old pride flared, when I hated needing his help to reach something on the shelf or carry something too heavy. But then he'd touch my shoulder, gently, grounding me without words. I began to realize that love at 72 looked different than love at 17. It wasn't all fire and urgency. It was warmth, steady as a candle that doesn't burn out. It was shared silence, laughter over old jokes, the simple comfort of knowing someone was on the other side of the wall when night fell. And for the first time since the fire, since losing everything I thought defined me, I began to feel like maybe, just maybe, I was home again. It had been nearly a month since the fire, and I'd settled into a rhythm in Thomas's home. The mornings no longer felt foreign. The garden paths had become familiar under my feet, and I'd even started leaving my suitcase unpacked. Little by little, I let myself believe I belonged. Then the knock came. Not the gentle, steady knock I had come to associate with Thomas's presence, but a sharp, impatient pounding that rattled the glass panes in the door. Thomas was in the garden, so I answered it myself. My son stood there, his face tight with something between anger and shame. Behind him, his car engine still idled, puffing little clouds of exhaust into the crisp afternoon air. "Mom," he said, his voice clipped, "we need to talk." I stepped aside, though every bone in my body told me not to. He came in, glancing around the living room like he was measuring it against some invisible standard. His eyes landed on the two mugs sitting side by side on the coffee table, the folded blanket on the sofa, my knitting basket tucked neatly in the corner. "So it's true," he muttered. "What's true?" I asked, though I already knew. "That you're living here." With him, he spit out the word like it was something sour. I crossed my arms, steadying myself. "Yes, I am." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "Do you have any idea how this looks? You move in with a man after Dad's been gone. What, 5 years? 10? 7, I corrected quietly. "And what I do now is my choice." He stopped pacing and stared at me. "Your choice? Mom, you're 72. You just lost your home. You should be with family, not—" He gestured broadly, as if the walls themselves were guilty. "Not clinging to some old fling from your youth." The words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they were so far from the truth. My son saw only scandal, disruption, inconvenience. He couldn't see the lifeline Thomas had thrown me, the way he had reminded me I was still more than a shadow. I straightened, my voice firmer than I felt. "Family, you say? Family who told me I wasn't welcome? Family who let me walk out with nothing but a suitcase?" He winced, but didn't deny it. "That wasn't my choice." "But you didn't stop it," I interrupted. "You stood by and let it happen." The silence that followed was thick, each of us breathing hard like we'd run a race. Thomas stepped in from the garden then, wiping dirt from his hands. He froze when he saw us, sensing the storm. "Everything all right?" My son turned, bristling. "This is your doing, isn't it?" Taking advantage of her when she's vulnerable, Thomas's eyes hardened, his voice low and even. "I didn't take her. She came to me, and she stays because she wants to." "Wants to?" my son snapped. "She doesn't know what she wants. She's grieving. She's confused I couldn't stay silent." "Stop it," I said sharply. My son blinked, startled. I rarely raised my voice. "Don't speak for me as though I'm a child. I know exactly what I want." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. For the first time, I saw him not as my boy, but as a man unwilling to accept that his mother had a will of her own. I stepped closer, my voice quieter now, but steady. "You cast me out." And Thomas opened his door. "That's the truth. If you can't accept it, that's your burden to carry, not mine." His face flushed, his jaw tight. He shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and turned for the door. He didn't slam it. He wasn't that cruel. But the sound of it closing behind him might as well have been an axe splitting wood. The silence left in his wake was heavy. I sank onto the sofa, my hands trembling. Thomas sat beside me, close but not touching, letting me have my space. After a long moment, he spoke. "You chose yourself today." "That's not easy." I pressed my palms together, staring at the lines of my hands. "I don't know if I've ever really done that before." He reached over, covering my hands with his. "Then let this be the start." For the first time, I let the weight of that truth settle in. My life had always been about others, my parents, my husband, my son. But maybe now, at 72, I was allowed to choose for myself. The weeks after my son's visit were quiet but not peaceful. His words echoed in my mind at odd hours, stirring guilt and doubt, even as Thomas's steady presence anchored me. I wanted to believe I'd chosen the right path, that I had earned this second chance. But then, just as life began to feel steady again, the ground shifted beneath me. It started one morning at breakfast. Thomas was buttering toast, humming off-key to a tune on the radio, when suddenly he paused. His hand trembled, the knife slipping from his fingers. "Thomas?" I asked, my voice sharp with fear. He smiled faintly, dismissing it. "Clumsy hands." Happens to the best of us, but it wasn't just once. Over the next days, I noticed other signs. He moved slower. He tired easily. Twice I found him sitting in the garden, staring at nothing, his breath uneven. The breaking point came one night when I heard a heavy thud from the bathroom. I rushed in to find him on the floor, gripping the sink, pale and sweating. "I'm fine," he insisted, trying to wave me off, but his voice was weak, his body heavy in my arms. I called an ambulance despite his protests, my heart pounding as they loaded him onto a stretcher. At the hospital, the sterile smell and buzzing machines made my stomach churn. I sat in the waiting room, my hands twisted together, praying like I hadn't in years. I thought of the fire, the loss of my home, my son's rejection, but none of it had scared me like this. Losing Thomas now, just as I had found him again, felt unthinkable. When the doctor finally came, his expression was measured, professional. "It was a mild heart attack," he said. "He's stable now, but he'll need rest and monitoring." No more pretending he's invincible. Relief and fear tangled inside me. Stable. Rest. Those words gave hope, but they also whispered of fragility. Time was no longer a distant shadow. It was standing right in front of us. I sat by his hospital bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. He looked smaller there, dwarfed by the machines, stripped of the quiet strength he carried at home. His hand twitched against the blanket, and I reached out, threading my fingers through his. His skin was warm, his grip faint but real. His eyes fluttered open, finding me instantly. A weak smile tugged at his lips. "Didn't mean to scare you." I laughed softly, though it cracked in my throat. "You did more than scare me." He squeezed my hand gently. "Guess you'll have to stick around and keep an eye on me." I leaned closer, my tears spilling onto the sheet. "I'm not going anywhere." Those nights in the hospital were some of the longest of my life. I barely slept, afraid to miss a change in his breathing, afraid the beeping machines might suddenly fall silent. Nurses tried to reassure me, but I couldn't shake the memory of how easily I'd lost everything in the fire. What if this time it was him? One night when the ward was quiet, Thomas stirred and looked at me. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought I had time." "Thought I could take my time with you. Guess I was wrong." I pressed his hand to my cheek, my tears hot. "We still have time. Don't you dare give up on me now." He chuckled weakly. "There's that fire in you." Always loved that his eyes closed again, his breathing evening out, and I sat there clutching his hand like an anchor. When he was finally discharged, frail but alive, I brought him home with me. I fussed over him more than he liked, hovering with tea, blankets, medicine reminders. He grumbled, but his eyes softened every time he caught me watching. For years, I had been the one abandoned, the one left behind. But here, now, I had the chance to stand guard for someone else. I wouldn't let him face this alone. Not him. Not again. And as I tucked the quilt around him that night, smoothing it with trembling hands, I whispered to myself a vow I hadn't spoken aloud. I lost my home, my past, my family's welcome. But I will not lose him. Not while there's breath in his body. Thomas's recovery was slow, measured in small victories. At first, just walking from the bedroom to the kitchen left him breathless. I hovered, nervous, ready to catch him if he faltered. He hated that, of course. "I'm not made of glass," he'd mutter. "No," I'd answer, handing him a chair. "But you're not made of steel either." He'd sigh, but his eyes always softened. Over the weeks, strength crept back into him like sunlight returning after a storm. He walked further each day, his color returning, his humor sparking again. The first time he insisted on making me tea instead of the other way around, I nearly cried at the sight of him standing steady by the stove. The brush with loss had changed us both. We no longer pretended time was endless. Instead, every morning felt like a gift, every evening a chance to say what had gone unsaid for decades. One afternoon, when the weather finally warmed, we drove to the park by the water. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue streaked with soft clouds. We walked slowly, his arm looped through mine for balance, our steps careful but sure. Children ran past, dogs barked, joggers huffed by, but we moved at our own pace, unhurried. At a bench overlooking the river, we sat. The water shimmered in the light, just as it had when we were young and used to sit by its banks, dreaming of a future we never shared. "It's strange," I said, watching the current. "When I lost the house, I thought I'd lost my life too. Everything I had, gone in one night, and then my own son." My voice faltered, but I pressed on. I thought I was finished. Useless. Alone, Thomas's hand found mine, his fingers rough but steady. "You weren't finished. You were waiting. For this." For us, I turned to him, tears blurring my vision. "After all these years, do you ever wish things had been different? That I'd chosen you back then?" He gave a small, wistful smile. "Every day. But then I remember. We wouldn't be who we are now. And maybe it took all those years, all those losses to bring us back here." I rested my head on his shoulder, the steady beat of his heart reassuring beneath the frailty. "I don't want to waste what's left," I whispered. "Then don't," he said simply. "We'll live whatever time we have. Fully. Together." The simplicity of it settled into me like a balm. For so long, I had measured life in what was lost. The house, the years, the relationships fractured. But sitting there with him, hand in hand, I realized life could also be measured in what remained. And what remained was love, steady and enduring, even after decades apart. We stayed on that bench until the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and lavender. I watched the light shift on his face, softening the lines, revealing glimpses of the boy I'd once known and the man I now cherished. When we finally rose to leave, I felt lighter. Not because the pain of the past had vanished, it never would, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. Back at the house, as I tucked him into bed, he caught my hand and held it tightly. "Promise me something," he said. "Anything. Don't let fear steal the days we have left. Not fear of what people think, not fear of time. Just live with me." That's all. I bent down and kissed his forehead, my lips lingering against his. "Skin, I promise." That night, lying awake, I thought about the strange path that had brought me here, a fire that had burned away everything I thought I needed, a rejection that had nearly broken me, and a faded name in an old book that had opened the door to something I thought was long gone. At 72, I had lost my home, but I had found something greater, myself, my voice, and the man who had loved me all along. Sometimes I realized endings aren't endings at all. They're beginnings we never expected. So here I am, 72 years old, sitting in a house I never imagined I'd call home, telling you this story. If you had told me a year ago that I would lose everything in a fire, be turned away by my own son, and then find myself reunited with the man I loved before life even began, well, I would have laughed, or cried, or both. Life has a way of undoing us, doesn't it? Just when we think we've got it all figured out, it shakes the ground and leaves us standing in the rubble. That night of the fire, when I clutched my old suitcase and watched the flames swallow my memories, I thought it was the end of me. And when my son told me, "Mom, my wife doesn't want you here," I believed the world had closed its doors for good. But sometimes the ashes clear, and what you find is not emptiness, but something waiting, something you didn't know you still had the courage to reach for. For me, it was a name in a faded book, a number scrawled in ink that should have long disappeared. And when I dialed it, when I heard his voice again, it was as if time folded in on itself. I won't lie to you. Starting over at this age is hard. Pride tells you not to lean on anyone. Fear whispers that you're too old for second chances, that the world has no use for you anymore. And grief tries to convince you that love, real love, belongs only to the young. But I've learned that's not true. Love doesn't care about the calendar. It doesn't expire. It waits quietly through the years. Sometimes it hides. Sometimes it gets buried under duty and expectation. But it doesn't die. When Thomas said to me, "You kept me waiting," I realized he hadn't been waiting just for a woman he once knew. He had been waiting for the chance to love me again, wrinkles, scars, losses and all. And I, without even knowing it, had been waiting too. To those of you listening now, maybe you're watching from a quiet living room or a kitchen table, or even lying awake in bed, let me tell you this: it's never too late. Not for joy, not for laughter, not for love. You can lose your house, your possessions, even the approval of those you thought would stand by you, and still find yourself in the arms of something true. Do I regret the years we lost? Of course. Sometimes the weight of them presses on me like a stone, but I don't live in regret anymore. I live in gratitude. For the mornings I wake to the sound of his kettle, for the evenings we spend watching the sun slip behind the trees, for the quiet assurance of his hand resting over mine. My son still doesn't understand. Maybe he never will. But I've stopped living for his understanding. I've stopped apologizing for needing, for wanting, for choosing what fills me with life. That perhaps is the greatest gift of growing old. You realize you don't have to prove yourself to anyone anymore. So yes, at 72, I lost my home in a fire. But in the ashes, I found something far greater. I found love. I found hope. And maybe, most importantly, I found myself. Now, before I finish, I'll ask you the same thing I asked at the beginning. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below, because maybe, just maybe, sharing where we are helps us remember that none of us are really alone. And if you take one thing from my story, let it be this: when life takes everything from you, don't close the book. Turn the page. You never know what might be waiting there. Maybe even the voice of someone who's been waiting for you all along.